Okay, hello everyone, both those of you who are here in the room and those of you who are here from other rooms. Welcome to the Rutgers Center for Cultural Analysis. I'm Leah Price, acting director of the center, and it's my privilege to introduce our dismayingly timely discussion of reproductive justice in a world without Roe. Kimberly Mutcherson is co-dean and professor of law at the Rutgers Law School in Camden. Dean Mutcherson is a reproductive justice scholar whose work focuses on assisted reproduction, abortion, and maternal fetal decision-making, among other topics. Her work has appeared in numerous journals, and Cambridge University Press released her edited volume, Feminist Judgments, Reproductive Justice Rewritten, very recently in 2020. In 2021, Dean Mutcherson received the Association of American Law Schools Inaugural Impact Award. Dean Mutcherson also received the Center for Reproductive Rights Innovation in Scholarship Award in 2013. Johanna Schoen is professor of history at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, with an affiliation at the Institute for Health, Healthcare Policy, and Aging Research. She is the author of two books, Choice and Coercion, Birth Control, Sterilization, and Abortion in Public Health and Welfare in the 20th Century, 2005, and Abortion After Roe, 2015, which won the Welch Medal of the American Association for the History of Medicine. Professor Schoen has a long-standing commitment to working with abortion providers to use historical analysis to help preserve access to abortion care. Professor Mutcherson, would you be willing to begin?
Excellent. All right, there we go. So my job, because I'm a law professor, is to catch you up on where we are in terms of the law and kind of how we got here as we think about where we're going. One note I will make is that I'm going to use women and pregnant women today, and I'll also use pregnant people and people capable of pregnancy to capture the full scope of folks who may become pregnant or may choose to have an abortion. And then I really also want to be really clear that I am not going to always use gender neutral language, because I think that there are some places where it's really important for us to recognize the historical oppression of women in this country. So I want to start off really quickly by describing what reproductive justice is, because that is what we chose to use in the title here. And a lot of people hear that phrase and think it's just synonymous with reproductive rights, which is not true. Reproductive justice is a movement. It was started by Black women in the mid-90s, and it is much more expansive than our reproductive rights frame. So there are three pieces to reproductive justice. One, the human right to decide if and when a woman will have a baby and the conditions under which she'll give birth. Two, to decide if she won't have a baby and her options for preventing or ending a pregnancy. And then finally, and this in some ways I think is really core, parent the children that she already has with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy communities, and without fear of violence from individuals or the government. So as I'm talking about abortion, I am thinking about abortion within this larger frame, right? All the different impacts that our procreative choices or lack of procreative choices have across a really broad spectrum. So having sort of laid out RJ a little bit, now I'm going to go ahead and jump into the law. So as a starting point, there are lots of ways in which our government regulates procreation and parenting and sort of intimate parts of our lives. And they've done it through various cases, including cases like Meyer versus Nebraska and Prince versus Massachusetts. Those are about the right to the care, custody, and control of minor children, very old cases there. Skinner versus Oklahoma, which happened during the eugenics phase of this country's history. That was a case about the right to procreate. Griswold versus Connecticut and Eisenstadt versus Baird. Both of those cases are about the right to access birth control. And then, of course, we have our abortion cases, Roe and Casey. then Lawrence and Texas, which are about the Lawrence v. Texas, which was about the right to same-sex sexual intimacy, and then Loving versus Virginia and Obergefell versus Hodges, which were our marriage cases, both interracial marriage and then same-sex marriage or marriage equality. So obviously the Supreme Court has poked its nose into lots of private parts of our lives for quite some time. And within those cases, the three rights really that we're talking about are very much in conjunction with thinking about reproductive justice, the right to procreate, the right not to procreate, the right to parent our children, and basically how we choose to create our families. So I want to really highlight a couple of things about Roe and Casey in order to understand where we are with Dobbs. So Roe decided in 1973 in that case, which was decided 7-2, which we really don't see in abortion cases anymore. They're very fractured. The court said that there's a fundamental right to an abortion. They said that the state has an interest in potential life. And then they created this trimester framework. And under the trimester framework of Roe, the court said that in the first trimester, there can be no regulation of abortion. In the second trimester, states can regulate, but they can only regulate to protect the health of the pregnant woman. And then in the third trimester, states can go so far as to ban abortion, but any ban has to have an exception for the life and health of the pregnant woman. So that was the law from about 1973 on. And the next really landmark case was Casey in 1992. There, the court upheld the constitutional right to an abortion, but it rejected the trimester framework and said largely that they felt like in its past cases, it had not shown enough reverence for the state's interest in potential life. And so they were going to try to fix that in Casey. So we're going to get rid of the trimester framework and we're just going to focus on the line of viability. And it created the undue burden standard, which basically said states can't place a substantial obstacle in the path of a pregnant person who is seeking a pre-viability abortion. So Casey in 1992 really opened up the floodgates, and we saw hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation to roll back abortion rights in this country. And so after Casey, the court said, well, you can't have spousal notification or consent laws. That's not okay. But you can have waiting periods. You can have biased informed consent. So including informed consent required by the state that gives factually inaccurate and scientifically inaccurate information. And you can have parental notification laws, but those parental notification laws have to include an opportunity for a judicial bypass. So if we take Roe and Casey together, right to privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's right to determine whether to terminate her pregnancy. A fetus is not a constitutional person. That states can't ban abortion before fetal viability, which is going to be in 23, 24 week range. Any bans have to include an exception for the life and health of the pregnant person. There are going to be no requirements for spousal notification or consent, and women under the age of 18 can be required to notify or get consent from their parents or guardians before they have an abortion, but only if there is a judicial bypass option. So that was the law before Dobbs and before the last Supreme Court term. I'm not going to really talk about this case. I just want you to know that in 2020, the court did have another abortion case in front of it and reaffirmed Roe and Casey in 2020. The only thing that changed between 2020 when they decided June Medical Services versus Russo and Dobbs was who sat on the court. That's it. So the 2022 Supreme Court term was basically a dumpster fire. And actually today is the first day of the 2023 term. And so, gird your loins because it's going to be another big one. So Dobbs came down in 2022. The court very specifically, or the majority of the court, overruled Roe and Casey. So everything that I said about, fundamental right to terminate a pregnancy, no bans before viability, a fetus is not a constitutional person, all of that basically is out the window now under Dobbs. And the court said that there's no constitutional right to an abortion because it is not enumerated in the Constitution, and a right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions, which is one of the tests that the court has used in the past to determine what is a fundamental right. I would be remiss if I didn't mention all sorts of words that are not in the US Constitution, including the word privacy, including the word woman. But yeah, we'll just slide past that. So where we post Dobbs, we are basically in a state of chaos and confusion, and we're going to be here for some time to come. So we're seeing lots of states that are legislating, which is what we expected. The New York Times has had a pretty decent abortion tracker. So that's one place where you can go if you want to know what's going on. This one hasn't been updated as recently as I would like. But it basically shows about 14 states that have bans in place that are either total or partial bans on abortion. Most of those statutes do not include an exception for rape or for incest. Some ban all abortions, some have gestational limits. Oklahoma, for instance, bans from the moment of fertilization, which is probably a little bit of overreach. Other bans are at 6 weeks, 15 weeks, 18 weeks, 20 weeks, right? We're really sort of all over the place. But again, we're seeing tons of legislation that is still happening. So this is going to be changing and changing pretty quickly. We already saw clinics closing. So this is Jackson Women's Health. They were the plaintiffs in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. And their clinic has closed. They were the last abortion clinic in Mississippi. And so now there are no such clinics in Mississippi. We will see the same thing happening in other states. We are seeing women being denied access to appropriate miscarriage management because providers aren't sure what they can do and when they can do it. And that has been an incredibly tragic thing for us to see. We are seeing shortages or denials of access to abortion medications that are used for other purposes, right? So abortion meds aren't just, the medication abortion meds aren't just used for abortion. They can also be used for other conditions. And so we're seeing pharmacists who are refusing to fill prescriptions, even if it is not for an abortion. We are going to see and are already starting to see medication abortion on the chopping block. Medication abortion is one of those things that significantly changes our landscape in terms of access to abortion. From 1973 versus where we are now. And so for those states that want to make sure that people can't have abortions within their borders, it is absolutely necessary for them to target medication abortion very specifically. Definitely, we have concerns about who's going to learn how to perform abortions going forward. So imagine that you're going to medical school in a state where abortion is banned. No one in that hospital is going to be able to teach you how to perform an abortion, even when an abortion needs to be performed to save a pregnant person's life. We are going to see increased criminalization of pregnant people. We've already seen some state legislators talking about the importance of not just punishing providers, but punishing pregnant women or people who choose to self-manage their own abortions. And what we know about what happens when you criminalize pregnancy is that the people who tend to get targeted are poor women, women of color, especially Black women, who are overrepresented in the folks who have abortions in this country. And then we're also going to see a lot more deaths of pregnant women. And that is regardless of bans, et cetera, because we live in a country that has the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed nation. And if you are forcing more women to remain pregnant, more of those women are going to die. And for Black women, the rate of maternal mortality is 2 to 5 times that of white women. So in particular, we're going to be seeing more Black women dying. And in addition, of course, we're just going to see lots of litigation, lots of legislation, and lots of ruminating about what comes next. We're also going to see states like our state, New Jersey, taking steps not only to protect abortion access within our borders, but to protect folks maybe getting abortions, who may come to our state in order to get abortions. And then I wanted to share this graphic in particular because I want to be really clear about who gets hurt when we ban abortions. So we know that the vast majority of folks who get abortions in this country are poor or low income, 75% of them. 59% of them already have children at home, so they are making decisions not just for that particular pregnancy, but for their family as a whole. 60% of these folks are in their 20s, so they are relatively young when making these decisions. And as I said, people of color are overrepresented in the statistics for abortion. Sorry, let me go back really quickly. 39% of abortion patients are white, 28% are Black, and about 25% are Latino. So again, the impact falls disproportionately on people of color. So I want to stop now and just make a couple of quick, like one really quick point. And the really quick point that I want to make is that even before Dobbs dropped, anti-choice legislators across this country were passing literally hundreds of pieces of legislation every single year that made it harder and harder for people to access abortion services. Again, particularly the most vulnerable women, poor women, women of color, younger women, women who lived in rural communities. And so really what we're seeing now, right, this sort of surge in activity around abortion is because the net has been cast much wider, right? And so there are lots of people who didn't really think of themselves as being subject to this country's history of reproductive oppression, are suddenly imagining that that is something that could happen to them as well. So let me just leave it as that. Obviously a lot more to talk about, but hopefully that gives you a sense both of what reproductive justice has to do with this conversation and also where we are in terms of the law.
Thank you very much for that. Johanna, would you like to launch in?
So I am going to complement what Kim has said, and I decided for today not to talk about the history of abortion since Roe, partly because Kim eloquently laid out the legal history, and partly because whenever I talk about abortion and the Dobbs decision now, I realize that there's so many things that people don't know about abortion, and I'm not quite sure that at the moment actually the history of abortion is the most important thing for people to know. So what I do want to do is talk a little bit about how abortion in the past 5 decades has been integrated in general healthcare, and then I want to talk about the reasons women have abortions to start with, because those are the things we don't really discuss, and I think they're really important. And so I'm going to just go by there. Hold on, I have the same issue that Kim has here. So over the past 5 decades, access to abortion care has become embedded in women's lives and in healthcare, and that means not just women's reproductive healthcare, but also other areas of healthcare as well. With increasing technical sophistication and development, abortion became the safest outpatient procedure after legalization. So immediately after abortion becomes legal, we also have the introduction of suction abortion, and with that, it becomes safer than any other outpatient procedure. In fact, today it is safer than its alternative, which is pregnancy and the birth of a baby. And it means that physicians could quickly and safely manage. It also means, that physicians today can quickly and safely manage miscarriages and ectopic pregnancies, for which, of course, these procedures are also important. Access to abortion, however, also has become integrated into other areas of healthcare, particularly when treatment for a disease meant that the drugs the woman has to take in order to get treated pose a danger for a developing fetus. So women with early stage cancer, for instance, which can now be detected when it is just developing and has the highest chance of treatment, could now receive treatment for it. But the problem is that because of the toxicity of cancer drugs, Women need to end an existing pregnancy before they start treatment. And so in this situation, many women would postpone childbearing until their treatment for cancer was complete and their bodies had recovered from the drugs. This is not only true for cancer, it is also true for other diseases. And last but not least, the ability to detect fetal anomalies, which are abilities and tests that really took off after legalization of abortion, right? These are really techniques that were developed in the 70s and in the 80s. The detection of fetal anomalies that are incompatible with the life of the fetus or might lead to lifelong suffering meant that women did not have to give birth to an infant only to see their infant suffer or die. Rather, women and their partners could now make the decision to end the pregnancy to avoid additional suffering. So what I'm trying to say here is that over the past 5 decades, abortion care became integrated into medical decisions and treatments that reach far beyond women's reproductive care. Treatments and decisions that frankly did not exist at the moment that abortion became legal in 1973. So a lot of things have changed over the past decades. Now, one of the things that we don't talk much about is why women decide to have abortions. And so I want to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes to give a little bit of a sample of the kind of moral decisions that women make when they decide to end a pregnancy. Over the past 5 decades, women have made a range of arguments for choosing abortion, and they have made those decisions within the context of their lives and their responsibilities to other family members. Many felt that childbearing and child raising should take place in a family context. Quote, I decided to have an abortion because I had no relationship with the father and believed that having a child at that point in my life would have ruined the rest of it, one young woman argued. Most had and have high expectations of themselves as mothers and sought an abortion because the realities of their lives meant that they were unable to meet their own expectations regarding parenthood. One woman in her mid-20s, who initially rejected her partner's desire for an abortion and planned to raise the child on her own, eventually changed her mind when the realities of single parenthood sunk in. I decided to go through with the pregnancy and even started picking out names for my baby, she wrote in a notebook for patients laid out in the recovery room of an abortion clinic. At night, though, I was feeling depressed and alone and began to realize the reality of wanting to raise a healthy baby in a supportive, wholesome environment. I deserve to have a partner who loves me and wants to raise a baby with me. I deserve to continue my goals of becoming financially successful. I know that I will be a wonderful mother someday when I'm ready to prepare and plan. Even women who had loving and supportive partners frequently felt that unplanned pregnancy was not the right foundation for marriage and childbearing. Although I was very fond of the guy, one woman explained her abortion as an 18-year-old freshman in college, I didn't want to get married. What a dreadful way to start a marriage. Marriages are such fragile things these days. I think they at least deserve a fighting chance. So many lives, often those of children, are seriously disturbed by bad marriages. A number of women seeking abortions try to protect their children from abusive relationships or to escape such relationships altogether. I knew this guy since high school, one mother of 2 explained her decision to have an abortion. He was my best friend until we took our relationship further. I became pregnant. My first pregnancy was complicated. He had changed. We would fight, and I'd be blocked or shoved into walls. How I didn't lose my daughter is a mystery. When I had my last daughter, things turned for the worse. I was forced to have sex. If I said no, it would be a fight and forced sex. When I found out I was pregnant, I wanted to be happy, but I felt rage and hate. After, I felt sad and alone. My parents aren't supportive, thankfully. My sister was, being she was forced into rape. I won't lie, I still feel like shit, but I know this was for the best. I will miss my daughter, but I know she will be safe. For many, becoming pregnant heightened their sense that they wanted to protect their future babies from a life of hardship. I have always been against abortions, but the feeling of pregnancy and being a mom gives you a sense of protection, one 17-year-old explains. I feel in my situation, I'm protecting my baby's life from a struggling household full of drama and speculation. I think of it as my baby being with God makes me so happy and relieved that my love is in heaven and being taken care of. Finally, women argued that they had a moral obligation to the children they were going to put into this world. Parents seeking to end wanted pregnancies after their fetus had been diagnosed with abnormalities saw their decision as protecting the fetus from unnecessary suffering. We found out he had a severe heart defect. That meant he would die slowly within a few days or weeks of being born, the husband of one patient wrote. We couldn't bear the thought of watching a baby slowly suffocate and die just so we could see him and hold him. That would be selfish. We chose to terminate so that he would die painlessly inside his mother, where he wouldn't ever have to know pain or suffering. And another explained, we are given the ability to have our children not suffer and rest peacefully, and it may not be the easiest decision, but some things are done to protect and for the love of our children. I will always love it with my last breath, but I cannot live with myself knowing the excruciating hardship that would have been in your years ahead. If you know that this child will suffer more on earth than you will having an abortion, one woman concluded, then that is a decision for you to make and only you to make. Now, with the increase of stigma surrounding abortion following the rise of the religious right in the 1980s and 90s, women were also more likely to frame their abortion decisions in religious terms. Many anguished over their decision and hoped God would forgive them. To help patients come to peace with their decision, staff at an abortion clinic would explore patients' religious and spiritual concerns. As one patient explained, I was raised in the Catholic faith, and although I'm not practicing, it was comforting to talk about God and forgiveness. Guilt may have been something I was and continue to feel, but now I feel little regret. Women found solace in their belief that God was all-knowing and forgiving. Only God can judge me, and he knew my decision before I knew, one woman wrote. Many patients did not merely think of their God as a forgiving God, they relied on God for guidance in their decision-making process. I prayed about this situation, one woman wrote, and I believe God is really listening and working through me. Some gained solace in the belief that their experience was preordained. I know you must feel like it's a sin, but actually it's not, one patient noted. God does things for a reason, and he chose this for us because it was better. Others felt that their finding and getting to the clinic itself was a sign that God forgave them for the abortion. If God had not wanted women to choose abortion, one patient noted, God would have put insurmountable obstacles in their way as to hinder the path. Indeed, patients felt that God guided them to the clinic. I have been praying, and we went over so many options to have the baby, one woman wrote. However, the cons outweighed the pros by a mile. Thank you, Lord, for giving me the team of doctors and nurses that you did. They were so kind and gentle. Thank you, Lord, for helping me find this facility. So instead of being an obstacle to a good abortion experience, women's religious beliefs, in fact, gave them the strength to make the abortion decision. And I read all of this to you really to emphasize that women have, for the past 5 decades, made moral decisions to have an abortion, right? They have thought about this strongly and deeply, and they have very deep-seated reasons why they have made this decision and why they need to continue to make this decision, only that these are issues that we usually don't talk about. So although women clearly articulate inside the abortion clinic that they have a moral obligation to their future children and sought abortion because they felt unable to take care of future children, were trying to escape abusive relationships, or were seeking to protect a fetus diagnosed with an anomaly from unnecessary suffering, the increasing stigma and shame surrounding abortion meant that they felt unable to articulate their very personal concerns outside a clinic. At the same time, anti-abortion activists and legislators, of course, deny that women and abortion providers make moral decisions about their reproduction and childbearing. From the perspective of the anti-abortion movement, a moral decision per se means a decision against abortion, and the Dobbs decision bears out this attitude. So although abortion is a healthcare procedure central to the lives of women, the decision does not mention women as individuals with a stake in the legal status of abortion. And by ignoring the very interest that women have in abortion, the decision denies women the ability to make their own moral decisions about their reproduction. Instead, the court has decided for them. The struggle over abortion has now returned to the state, and as this map, similar to the one that Kim put up, illustrates, it is also not updated, but it gives you a similar sense. In much of the US, abortion is already illegal or is about to be banned. The impact of this change will be most significant, as Kim pointed out, for young and poor women who lack the resources to travel to a state where abortion is legal. But it will also be felt by all women in need of medical treatments that have implication for women's reproduction. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the management of miscarriages and ectopic pregnancies, up to the treatments provided by rheumatologists and oncologists whose patients need access to abortion, since the treatments are often teratogenic, which means they're harmful to a developing fetus. So in Texas, to give only one example, oncologists say that they now wait for pregnant women with cancer to get sicker before they treat them, because the standard of care would have been to abort the fetus rather than to allow treatment that might damage the fetus. But a state law now allows abortion only at risk of death. And so the Dobbs decision not only limits women's control over their lives, it also illustrates that women's healthcare needs, like their lives, are of no importance to the court.
Great, thank you both. And Dean Mutcherson, would you like to respond to anything in Professor Schoen's presentation before we open up to the floor?
The one thing that I do want to say, and I'm really glad that you included so many quotes, Johanna, because I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough, right, in this conversation, is abortion stigma, right? That so many folks are not willing to tell their abortion stories, or if they are willing to tell their abortion stories, it is a story that is one of the more sort of sympathetic stories, right? So, it's a wanted pregnancy, you're X months in and find out from a scan that something awful is going on with your fetus. And so you end up terminating the pregnancy. And so, because we live in this world where for so long people have been discouraged from talking about abortion and their abortion decisions, we're now in this really interesting and difficult space, I think, of trying to really reconcile the importance that abortion has played in so many people's lives because they haven't told anybody about it. And obviously, it's nobody else's business, absolutely. But our failure to talk about abortion openly has an impact. And I think part of that impact is what we're seeing now.
Yeah, and I will clarify, I should have said that when I started reading the statements, right? But all of the statements in which women explained why they decided to end a pregnancy are from notebooks that were in a recovery room in an abortion clinic. So they were essentially writing notes to themselves. They were writing notes to the babies whose lives they were ending. They were writing notes to the other women who were having abortions. There was like a whole conversation going on in those books. And I tried to, basically choose a representative sample of the kind of ways in which women make clearly moral decisions about why they needed to end a pregnancy.
And you know what I'll add to that as well, is that in addition to people not talking about abortions, I think a lot of people have no concept of what an abortion clinic is like or was like, right? Since so many of them are going to be closing now, right? So the fact that there was a space for women to, you know, talk about their experience of abortion in the clinic, right? That was invited, that there was an understanding that people have, you know, different levels of, you know, concern about their decision to have an abortion, that some people talk very specifically within the clinic about terminating a baby. Other people don't use the language of baby, and that gets, you know, and in the best clinics, whatever the patient chooses is how they're going to talk about that pregnancy as well. So there's a real failure to, I think it's also to understand how important this collection of people have been who are deeply committed to providing abortion care in a way that is respectful, in a way that is gentle, and in a way that allows people to experience their abortion in the way that makes the most sense to them. So I did have one question that came in to me as a direct message. And that was a question about the some of the religious liberty cases that we are seeing. The one that got the most press was filed down in Florida from a Jewish group, saying that an abortion ban actually violates their right to practice their religion, because there are times in Judaism when abortion is required if it's necessary, and this is a quote from the lawsuit, necessary to protect the health, mental, or physical well-being of the woman. So those are really interesting cases. And in part, they're interesting cases because this current Supreme Court, nobody will be shocked by this, has been very expansive in its jurisprudence about religious liberty. But it has done so in cases that tend to involve people who are Christian, and even more specifically, people who would likely describe themselves as Christian fundamentalists in some ways. And so the thing that would make me really interested in seeing these kinds of cases by folks who are saying actually abortion is important to us in the context of our faith, is actually forcing the Supreme Court to decide whether, when it talks about protecting religion, it actually means religion, or if they mean Christianity. And I would love to see them squirm there. So we'll see what happens. But certainly other religious groups absolutely have standing to sue, and not just under the federal constitution, but under their state constitutions as well.
I think one of the problems is that most people really don't know enough about abortion, right? And that includes in particular the kind of things that Kim and I talked about today, the who is really impacted by the Dobbs decision, what is the wide range of medical treatments that are suddenly coming under danger, that don't even have to do with issues of reproduction, and really what are the women, what arguments are women making about why they need abortion? And in particular, one of the things that really struck me when I was reading through the notebooks is how many women talked about their faith and how important their faith was in order to make the abortion decision, in order to figure out that they wanted to end the pregnancy. They talk about praying to God in order to finding the abortion clinic. They talk about how God was guiding the hands of abortion providers when they were performing the procedures. And they talk about how relieved they are that their baby is now with God, which is really how they describe it. They talk about, and I didn't quote that here, but that they feel that their baby is looking down and protecting them, and that their baby will be able to return at a better time when a pregnancy is working better for them. And I do feel that at least indicating to religious family members that their conclusion that their religion tells them that they have to be against abortion is their particular conclusion, but that women can be religious and can come to the opposite decision. And that really it's more a question of respecting the conclusions that other people who might be just as religious, right, are coming to. And so, yes, I think it is perfectly legitimate to some people who have deeply held faiths that tells them they can never end a pregnancy, not to end a pregnancy for themselves, but they can't really make that decision for anybody else. And I think that is as far as one can go, but it is far enough, right? Because what the Supreme Court has done here and what legislators are doing is making decisions for somebody else rather than saying, well, I wouldn't do it and ending it there.
So all I would add to that, well, I'll add a couple of things. The first thing that I will add is that I have reached a point, having been doing this work for quite some time, where I don't really have discussions with people who don't believe in access to abortion, right? Because particularly if the position they are coming from is entrenched in their religion or their moral sense of a fetus, there's just not much for us to talk about, quite frankly. So I kind of try to avoid those conversations. That being said, I do want to add, in addition to what Johanna was saying about abortion patients, that there are also abortion providers who think of what they do as a part of their faith, and what it means to provide care to women and to respect women. And I think it's really important not to forget that. And then the other thing that I think, if you were to have such conversations that might be useful, is also talking to people about the ways in which a lot of this conversation ends up being about sort of punishing women for their sexual lives, right? And why would you want pregnancy to be a punishment, right? Why would you want a child to be brought into the world because their parent was forced to stay pregnant? That seems like a really odd choice to me, frankly. And then the other thing that I will sometimes say, or used to say to people, I don't do it anymore, but I'll sometimes do it in class. The other thing is, name another set of circumstances where you are comfortable with the government telling you that you have to use your body to save somebody else.
Thank you, Kim. So we've
Can I
got,
follow up for 1 second? So I just put in the chat one of the books that makes a case for abortion on the basis of religion, and it's Willie Parker's Life's Work, a Moral Argument for Choice. That might be really helpful to kind of look at. So before abortion became legal, for instance, there was an underground network of clergy people who helped women find illegal abortions. The Clergy Consultation Service, you could Google that and look up what some things written about it. That might be really helpful also as a piece of information to family members.
great, Dean Wolkowitz.
Hi, thanks to both of you. This has been really, really terrific. And I feel like it's the beginning of a conversation I now feel, since I know about this course, that we'll all be having for the full year. So I have what I think is probably kind of a really pragmatic question, so it shifts things. But are women legally required to know they're pregnant? I put it that way because it seems to me that if you were to go and, if you think about Plan B, like which people often take without knowledge of whether they've gotten pregnant, but just in case. Or one could imagine another version of that where doctors might perform a procedure that might induce abortion if you were pregnant, but if you didn't know the person was pregnant, you'd just be doing the procedure. And I could imagine in between that other kinds of medical interventions that are later than Plan B that you could just take without any knowledge whatsoever about. And I don't know if there are analogies with other kinds of health conditions where you treat them in the absence of knowledge of positive or negative, that you don't know whether you need to be doing it, but you do it prophylactically in some way. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to that. What happens if you have some kind of a surgical intervention or a medical intervention, but you don't know one way or another you're pregnant, is it illegal to take those pills no matter what?
Kim, I will have to leave that to you because it's really a legal question, but a really good one.
I mentioned it, let me just add to that, because I have a teenage daughter, and there's a lot of conversation among young women these days, I think, about not keeping track of their periods anymore online.
Yeah, not
but
on
it
the
seems
app,
to me
yeah.
that the next move of that could be sort of like having a somewhat agnostic relation to the question of whether or not you might be pregnant.
Yeah.
And imagining that that might be useful for you in some situation in order to have more agency over what happens to your body. So,
I'm not a huge podcast person. I became one during the pandemic, and an episode of Invisibilia that came out not so long ago is called A Little Bit Pregnant. And it is basically about this question, right? If you are taking something to bring your period back and you don't know why you're not having your period, you just want it back, and nobody does a pregnancy test, then have you had an abortion? And so I think it's fascinating. I don't have quite a legal answer for it yet. But I also just would point out that there are certainly long traditions of women not taking pregnancy tests, not knowing that they are in fact pregnant, but getting, pills from, the local woman down the street, right? Who everybody knows that's who you go to when you haven't had your period for 3 months and you really want to get it back. So I think that what we're going to see is, and they're already, if you listen to this podcast episode, you will hear that folks are already sort of talking about this, that this is, and talking about it in this sort of weird new way, as though there haven't been women doing this for each other for a very, very long time. So we'll see what happens with that. I mean, inevitably, state legislators will try to figure out a way to get to that behavior as well. What I would assume they would do is say, for instance, you can't get period pills unless you have a pregnancy test, and then they'll get sued over that too. So I think the question itself is a really, really great one and an interesting one, and we'll see how it plays out.
I have to say, I do always wonder, so now when I lecture on this and I give the traditional lecture that I didn't do today, we do of course start with pre-Roe and the women's health movement, and Carol Downer and Lorraine Rossman's invention of the DLM, which was basically a handmade little suction device that women could use in order to keep regular, right? To bring on their period and just have it all, suctioned out in one instance, so you didn't have to deal with it the entire week. I do always wonder whether that is something that will come back in vogue, because that did exactly that. You didn't know whether you were just basically bringing on your period or whether you might have been pregnant.
What I think we are more likely to see are lawsuits against healthcare providers because they make decisions that they think are in keeping with local statutes that have a really negative impact on their pregnant patients. So imagine, for instance, that you are a person who is having a miscarriage, and if the physician acted at a certain point, there is a greater chance to preserve your fertility, but the physician doesn't act because their concern is, well, we can't do anything until you get to a certain level of sickness under state statute. So I think we're going to see some interesting but difficult medical malpractice cases coming out of some of these laws.
So we have a related question, a possibly related question on the Zoom from April Barkas, who asks, who points out that abortion is a fundamental need for people with disabilities. So her first question, without exceptions, we're putting so many people in immediate danger. Can you comment on that? And the second question is, how can we combat the issues with prescriptions of medications that are not primarily abortive agents, such as
Methotrexate.
Thank you, Johanna.
Okay.
We are seeing insurance companies denying those refills for people who rely on those medications for conditions unrelated to reproductive rights. Would you be willing to speak to that, Johanna?
Kim, can I also turn that over for you for the initial and then maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the issues that was actually flagged in, I think in Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence in Dobbs was, can you have an abortion law that does not include an exception for, at least for life, maybe not for health, but an exception for life. And he seemed to be taking the position that such a law would be unconstitutional and would not be able to stand, which is really interesting. That has not been tested yet. And we already see states that have laws that do not have those exceptions. And so, you know, I've been saying sort of jokingly, and yet it's absolutely true. The big winners in this case are lawyers, because we're going to be litigating these issues for years and years and years to come. But I think one of those big pieces of litigation is going to be about whether you have to at least have a life exception, if not a health exception as well. So we'll see how that plays itself out. On the second question about people not being able to get access to medications because they are thought to be related to, because they can provide abortions even if they aren't being used for abortions. What's tricky about that is that pharmacists, you know, pharmacists have a right to not fulfill your prescription, right? They have a right to act with conscientious objection to the prescriptions that people are asking for. So that's not going to go anywhere. So that will continue to be an issue, unfortunately. This is a place where the federal government has tried a little bit to step in, and I think that they may have to do more on this issue. And just to sort of give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So we've already seen folks trying to kind of redefine what an abortion is in these very strange ways, I think, right? So for instance, you know, people testifying in front of Congress, anti-choice people testifying in front of Congress and saying, well, you know, if you have an ectopic pregnancy and they remove it, that's not an abortion. Okay. Or if you think about a case like the Hobby Lobby case, which was a Affordable Care Act case many, many years ago. And in that case, Hobby Lobby was saying that they didn't want to cover certain types of birth control because they felt like those types of birth control could, in some cases, keep a fertilized egg from implanting. And for them, that was an abortion. So these questions of how we define things and who gets to define things and decide, you know, what's illegal or legal based on those definitions is going to be another thing that we fight about, frankly, and unfortunately.
And I guess the one thing that I would add to that, although that no longer directly addresses the question, but it does get back to a question that Elizabeth Campus asked at the very beginning, really is, what can I as a female student do, right? And so when I talked to students at Kean University last week, who were also all, you know, the age of undergraduate students, I said the most important thing you can do is talk to your friends and talk to your family members and make it clear what the issues are and why they are so important, and pay attention at the elections. Because it is now on the state level where women's access in all states, you know, it's state law that determines women's access. So make sure that people understand that, and that they understand legislators' priorities or not, and that they know who they are voting for, and that their friends know what they're voting for. I mean, one of the things that really struck me when I was speaking at Kean, and that also strikes me when I'm looking here, right? At Kean, there were some young men who were part of the audience because it was a class requirement, and a number of them spoke up afterwards and said that they never realized that this was something that was also of importance in their lives. And so talk to your male friends, it's super important, and just keep doing it. I think that is one of the most powerful things that we can do at the moment.
And another thing that I think is super practical, make sure that your health centers on all of your campuses provide Plan B through the health center. And if they don't, that is a thing that's completely worth agitating for.
Not necessarily now, but before the session ends, I was wondering, this, in the context of the US, I feel like there's always at moments like this to turn towards the US, like national, and I don't know, to look turn internally, like the view turns internal.
Yeah.
And I understand like the importance of paying attention to state legislative movements, elections, so on and so forth. Is there anything to be gained from looking outwards? And I remember in the aftermath of the Dobbs, right, decision, that there were these criticisms about the fact that pro-choice movements in the US did not work with and did not cooperate or collaborate with, movements elsewhere, right? I mean, so first, to put things into a kind of a global context, what country in the last, century has overturned its sort of legalization of abortion in the way that the US has? What, if anything, does the US state to, stand to learn or gain from thinking about how other sort of, I don't know, Catholic or Christian, countries, majority countries have actually legalized, right, abortion?
So there are, of course, attempts to help offer access to abortion care in Canada and in Mexico for women who are close enough to the border, right? One of the things that always fascinates me in the United States is that progress in science that makes it possible to do certain things. And here, for instance, I'm thinking about the mismanagement of fetal anomalies, because you can test for them very late and you can make procedures available to end pregnancies for fetal anomalies. That is still legal in the few clinics in which it was legal. Go hand in hand in this country with a deep religious conservatism, right? And there's a disjuncture between kind of fundamentalism that we have as part of our culture, and that vision and integration and ability to make medical procedures available that you can't get anywhere else because you can do it, so we will make it possible. And that tension, I think, is particular to the US. I haven't really seen that anywhere else like it. And so to a certain extent, I think it is useful to look elsewhere, but I think that the problems that we face here, and that tension is, of course, not only there in terms of abortion care and fundamental religion, it's also there in terms of other healthcare issues. Let's just look at how we talked about COVID and masks and the immunization, right? It's the same tension, even though it plays out in a different way. And so for that reason, I sometimes find it difficult to look for other places as examples of something that we might be able to follow. But I might also just not be seeing what we need to see. Kim, what would you say?
No, I totally agree. And I think, one of the big things to remember, and this is, me coming from my legal perspective, our country doesn't care about human rights. We're not a human rights-based regime. We're a constitutional rights-based regime, right? And so if you're coming from a country that is, one, thinking much more globally about what it means to have rights, if you're coming from a country that understands human rights as not just being negative rights, but also positive rights, that's just a very different set of circumstances to be in. And it's also a very different set of circumstances if your country is part of a collective, right? And so you don't have to just sue in your country. You can take your country to a human rights court, right? That's a pretty amazing thing to be able to do. And that's just not, we don't do that here, right? We're very isolated, believe very deeply in how much better we are than everybody else. And certainly within the context of our legal regime, show almost no respect to laws outside of this country. And the other thing that we've seen from this Supreme Court is delight in cherry picking, right? So when they want to make, when they want to, compare us to somebody, they don't say, well, Ireland, deeply Catholic country, has changed its laws. They say we're in the same category as North Korea and whatever. I don't know. We're in a very ridiculous place right now. It's very frustrating.
Great, Rebecca.
I don't want to hold us if we're supposed to end, but just a question about that map that we saw early on, the states and where they were. I can't remember which presentation it was in, but where they were in the process of totally banning abortion to probably banning abortion to protecting abortion rights. And I was struck by Nebraska and South Carolina because it feels to me like, I think of Nebraska as a super red state. And I think of them being both states where there's a very large number of evangelical white Christians. And so I'm wondering whether there's anything we can learn about what happened in those states to protect abortion rights that could be useful for students or people concerned about abortion rights in, say, Virginia and North Carolina, which are obviously, actually, I think it was a little more purple than both Nebraska and South Carolina. And so just kind of wondering if you have any thoughts about those more local state-centered movements.
So I think one of the lessons to learn, and we learned this in Kansas, right, is that what your state legislature does and what the people of your state want can be very, very different from each other. And so where there are, and I'm not a huge fan of ballot initiatives because a lot of times they're total garbage. But this has been a space where the opportunity for individual voters to decide what the future of abortion is in their jurisdiction means that you get to bypass the legislature. And so I do think that there is definitely a lesson to be had there. And I think, the other lesson, frankly, for a lot of us that a lot of people have to learn is that every election counts. That those in-between elections where you just, you don't make it to the polls that year, and some, Yahoo ends up getting elected to the state legislature. People who live in Pennsylvania who get to vote on judges, right? Like those are not elections that you should be skipping. So, there's a way in which there are opportunities for individuals. And I say this with full knowledge that the Supreme Court has delighted in rolling back voting rights as well. But there are absolutely opportunities for individuals to shift their legislatures in one direction or the other. And if what you want is a state that is, increasing access to abortion, it may be that you need to be getting some people out of your state legislature and then also thinking about the opportunities for ballot initiatives.
I vaguely understand how Dobbs v. Jackson even got to the Supreme Court. So I was wondering if there's if there's a way, because Senator Lindsey Graham came out saying that it's not just about like state abortion bans, but like national abortion bans, as a participant was saying, the Constitution wasn't built off of human rights. So I was wondering if what would be the potential for like the legislative argument for creating a national ban? Is that a possibility that can go into the Supreme Court?
So big sigh. One of the things that I almost admire is the willingness to engage in hypocrisy, right? So in 1 week to say this is all about states being able to make individual decisions about access to abortion, and then 2 weeks later say what we really need is a national ban on abortion, right? There's something impressive about that. But yes, there could potentially be a national ban that comes out of Congress. It will be challenged. And if and when it is challenged, it will go to this Supreme Court. And so the question there will be, does Congress have the power And from where does that power derive to regulate abortion across the entire country? And I would put my money on this Supreme Court, at least the majority of the Supreme Court, being willing to find that such a power exists. And so that again puts us in a place of elections matter. Every single election matters. And so as we go into the midterms and think about who's going to end up in Congress, put your money where your mouth is, put your, you're marching where your mouth is, whatever. But if the Democrats lose both houses, it's gonna be a big problem for a lot of things, not just for abortion, obviously.
Kim, thank you for joining via Zoom. I hope that you feel much better in days to come. Thank you to everybody who joined us here.
Thanks so much, everybody.